Hey, welcome back, everybody. It's Timothy here with Mana Rocks, and this is part 6 of our Throne of Eldraine limited set review. We have the multi-color cards up this time, all of our gold cards. There's about 30 of them, so this is we're going to try to get through this. After this, we'll have one more video including all of the colorless cards, the colorless artifacts, and the lands. Will all be grouped into one video, so stay tuned for that. As always, feel free to subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments below if I either missed something. Maybe I misread something that's happened on a couple cards already, so thanks for the corrections in the comments. Or if you have any feedback, whether this was useful or not, feel free to let me know. You can also find us on Twitter at MTG_ManaRocks. By nature of this being a video about all the gold cards, there aren't going to be too many bad cards, so we'll see a lot of the cards grouped into the higher categories, but there are a couple to talk about early on. So again, the sideline cards, these are cards that you don't typically want to include in your main board. You either want to build around them, or they require a specific sort of deck, or they're just stone cold unplayable, which we're not going to see with a lot of gold cards. Or they're going to be sideboard cards, cards that you don't put in your main board, but when they do come in, they have a significant effect on the game. Just a couple to talk about here. The first one is Covetous Urge. This is quad blue or black mana. So there is a cycle of gold cards that have 4 blips of either color within their guild, if you will. In this case, it's blue, 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 black, 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 any combination of 4 of those mana. This, I believe, is the only one in this entire cycle that's not a creature, which is kind of interesting. But we've got an uncommon sorcery. It says target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-land card from that player's graveyard or hand and exile it. You may cast that card as long as it's exiled. You may pay mana of any color to cast that spell. So this lets you essentially take your opponent's best card out of their hand. If they don't have a particularly good card in their hand, you can choose one in their graveyard, and then you have access to it later in the game. So this is a very, very slow 2-for-1 if you grab a card out of your opponent's hand. The problem is, and the reason this is just not a good card, is because in best case scenario, you're spending 4 mana to take a card out of your opponent's hand, which is already very, very expensive. There are cheaper ways to do that in this set. There's a 3 mana discard spell, the one that puts adventures back in their graveyard. And that's probably your turn, right? You spent 4 mana your entire turn to take a card out of your opponent's hand, and then the following turn, you still have to spend mana to cast that spell, assuming it's something that's even worth casting. Very rarely will you choose to take a card out of your opponent's graveyard with this, just because taking a card out of their hand actually takes one of their resources, whereas taking something out of their graveyard just leaves them with all their resources. So you actually lose the 2-for-1 advantage of this card if you take a card out of their graveyard. There was a card in Theros, Psychic Intrusion, I believe, that was basically the same exact effect here for 5 mana, and it was stone cold unplayable. I don't think reducing the total CMC of that card by 1 and making it easier to cast in blue-black decks is a particularly big boon for the card, so I do think this is unplayable. Maybe I'm wrong. If this ends up being a slower format where the late game cards decide the matches, then sure, there's something here, but I just don't see it right now, and I would urge you not to play this card. Dance of the Manse is up next. It's X white blue for a rare sorcery. Return up to X target artifact or non-aura enchantment cards from your with converted mana cost X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. If X is 6 or more, those permanents are 4/4 creatures in addition to their other types. So this is a very powerful card if built around. If you have a bunch of artifacts or enchantments that are going to hit the graveyard, or you have some sort of self-mill going on where you're going to be able to mill your artifacts and enchantments into the graveyard, then Dance of the Manse is going to be a very, very powerful late game effect. Maybe not even a late game effect, right? Clearly, you want to be able to cast this where X is 6 or more so that you can get a bunch of 4/4s on board, and then it is a game-winning effect. But you can cast this with, like, X is 2 or X is 3 just to get some artifact or enchantments back onto the battlefield. The problem I see with this is that it really requires you to have artifact creatures, which there aren't a ton of in the set. There are artifact creatures floating around blue and white, but for the most part, the artifacts are either these really junky creatures, which we'll see in the next video, or they're like colored equipment and stuff like that, which you can get back with Dance of the Manse, but those cards don't typically go to the graveyard, right? Imagine a card like glass casket or one of the colored equipments, those tend to just stick around on the battlefield for the entire game, so they're not actually going to hit the graveyard that often for the dance to bring them back. Also worth noting that X has to be 6 or more if you're going to get all the permanents back as 4/4s, but you don't actually have to have 6 targets because it says up to. So let's say you have 8 mana, you can just reanimate 3 or 4 targets. You just have to actually dump a bunch of extra mana into this that's not reanimating targets, and you'll get a bunch of 4/4s back. So this is here as a sideboard card, or not a sideboard card, but rather a build-around card. It is a very powerful build-around card, and it does incentivize you to pick up artifact creatures higher than normal, but I don't think it's worth filling a deck full of the kind of clunky, crappy artifact creatures that are in this set. So, interesting effect, very powerful when it works, but requires a lot of work before it does something that you really want it to do. And that's it. So we're going to move into our filler cards. Again, not a lot of cards to talk about in this category. These are ones that they don't really stand alone as well. A lot of the gold cards are just very good on their own, assuming you're playing the 2 colors. These are the ones that need a little bit more work put into them before they become solid playables. The first one is Improbable Alliance. This is blue-red for an uncommon enchantment. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, create a 1/1 fairy creature token with flying. For 4 blue and a red, you may also draw a card and discard a card. Now, I do think this card can be quite powerful, but I do have to say with all of these second card matters cards, basically the same thing I said about all of the other ones in the other videos. If you don't support them, if you don't actually have a deck that has a bunch of card draw, then these cards lose a lot of their value, right? Blue-red, you should have a bunch of card draw, right? And being rewarded with 1/1 flyers every time you draw your second card on a given turn is actually quite powerful. There is a cap on it, right? There's a maximum of 1 fairy that can be made each turn. It's not like you can make 3 or 4 if you draw 3 or 4 extra cards each turn, but that's still quite good if you're able to somehow make a fairy every turn or every other turn, right? The reason I put this so low is because the activated ability is very expensive, and that's a little bit too late game of a plan for me to think that this is just going to control a board, and it doesn't really do anything early on in the game, right? Sometimes you might be able to play this on turn 2, and then on turn 3 and 4 you get to draw some extra cards, and you actually start going off, so there's some real power there, but you need to support this. Clearly, if you take this card, you're going to be in blue-red, which means that you can support it, but you need to draft around it, and this card is not a self-contained engine, right? If you are taking this card just because it has the activated ability on it, and that's your plan for making the fairy tokens, I don't think it's going to pan out. You need to actively take other cards that can trip or draw, or maybe instant speed draw spells to take advantage of making fairies on your opponent's turn. Drown in the Loch is up next. It's blue-black. For an instant uncommon, you choose one. Either counter target spell with converted mana cost less than or equal to the number of cards in its controller's graveyard. So let's say you want to counter a 4 CMC card. Your opponent has to have at least 4 cards in their graveyard. Or destroy target creature with converted mana cost less than or equal to the number of cards in its controller's graveyard. So if you want to kill a 5-drop creature, then they need to have at least 5 cards in their graveyard, right? So this is in blue-black, which has the theme of milling your opponent out. There are a couple cards that have incidental mill attached to them. There are some cards where the whole point of it is to mill your opponent, like the 0/4 adventure creature that mills for 4. If you are actively supporting this card, similar to the Improbable Alliance, then this becomes one of the best cards in your deck, right? Let's say you get to the point where your opponent has 6 cards in their graveyard. This is just going to kill any creature or counter any spell, and you get to choose which it does. So extremely flexible and very versatile, and going to hit a wide range of things that you need to hit. The reason that I'm giving it such a low rating is because it is kind of a dead draw early on in the game. If your opponent's playing an aggressive Knight deck and they go 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop, and they're bashing, and this is supposed to be your creature removal spell, this is supposed to be your answer to something, it's not going to do anything early on in the game unless you start casting other spells first that are going to put cards in your opponent's graveyard, and then it might be too late for this card to be super relevant. The other reason that I put this so low is because it's never better than a 1-for-1, right? It is going to be very, very good when you kill your opponent's 5 or 6 drop with this or counter a game-winning spell, but at best, it's a 1-for-1. You're only getting one card out of this. It's not like you're ever 2-for-1ing yourself with Drown in the Loch. So I do think this card is quite powerful. I'm not saying you shouldn't play it in your blue-black decks. You should play as many as you can, but don't rely on it in the early game. Make sure you still have early game interaction. Otherwise, this card loses a ton of its value, and you could just be stuck with this in your hand while you're getting run over by an aggressive deck. Escape to the Wilds is up next. This card's probably a lot more powerful than I'm giving it credit for. Same deal with all of these gold cards, but I'm skeptical, which is why I'm giving it such a low rating to start off with. In this case, we have a Gruul enchantment. It's 3 red green for a rare. It says exile. I'm sorry, I said enchantment. It's a sorcery. Sorcery. Exile the top 5 cards of your library. You may play cards exiled this way until the end of your next turn. You may also play an additional land this turn. So, clearly, if you have 5 lands at the start of the turn that you plan to cast this, then don't play a land from your hand. Just go ahead and cast Escape to the Wilds, and you can hit up to 2 land drops plus an additional 1 the turn after. So it kind of ramps you, but you're already at 5 mana, so that's not that big of a deal. What this does is just give you access to the top 5 cards of your library for the remainder of the turn that you cast this and the turn after. Now, that first part doesn't matter so much because you're already spending 5 mana to cast this spell. If it's turn 5, you cast Escape to the Wilds, then you basically have all of your mana for the following turn to try and cast as many of those spells as possible. So it's like a temporary draw spell, right? A lot of times you'll get 2 or 3 cards off of this, including a couple extra lands, which is nice, but I don't think that's super powerful, right? Again, the turn that you play this, you're probably not getting much value off of it other than an extra land. You're probably not going to be able to cast the spells that are underneath Escape to the Wilds the turn that you cast it. You're going to have to wait till the next turn. And similar to Drown in the Loch, that makes me skeptical about playing this against super aggressive decks, which there will be some in the format. So I do think this card's very powerful. I think similar to a lot of the other things I'm saying with these low pick cards is that you need to support it. You need to make sure you're not dying, and you need to make sure that the board is stabilized. Then these cards become quite powerful, but just as standalone cards, if you have no board presence and you cast Escape to the Wilds, I wouldn't expect it to get you out of that situation, since it doesn't really do anything until the following turn. And that's it. I'm going to go ahead and quit ragging on the cards that I think are a little bit more situational and start moving into the cards that are just always going to be solid regardless of what kind of deck you're playing. If you're able to cast these gold cards, then they're going to be good. They're going to have an effect on the game every single time. First one is Wintermore, or Wintermore, if you will. It's 1 green, white for a 3/3. It's an uncommon horse, and it says whenever you cast a creature spell that has an adventure, put a +1/+1 counter on Wintermore. This is a very green card. We saw in the green video that a lot of green strategy is just to put a bunch of power and toughness on board. This horse doesn't have evasion. It's a big beater, and it gets bigger, right? The reason, yes, it does require you to have adventures to be really good, but the reason that it's here in the solid playable category is if you're playing green-white and you play a Wintermore, that's a 3-mana 3/3, and that's going to be just good enough on its own. And then if you ever get a counter on it, it's going to be much, much better, and then it's just going to get stronger and stronger from there and start beating down, right? Note that you actually have to cast the creature half of the adventure for this to get a +1/+1 counter, so using the pump spells and using the extra adventure abilities aren't going to pump this, but the creatures will, whether or not you're casting them from exile or casting them from your hand. So not much to say here. If you're green-white, you're happy to play this card, even if you don't have any adventures, and the number of adventures you have will increase the power level of this card. Steelclaw Lance is up next. It's black-red for an uncommon equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+2, and the equip cost is 3, which already isn't bad. 2 mana, 3 mana to equip, and +2/+2 is okay. 3 mana to equip is just 1 more than I want to do for this. But the upside here, or rather the nuance of this card, is that you can equip it to a knight for a single mana. So this is in red-black. That is a knight archetype. That is the knight colors outside of white. And if you can equip for 1 mana, this card actually becomes very, very good, right? It makes anything a threat. You can do the trick where you equip before attacks, attack with a big creature, and then use a single mana to move it to another knight on defense. and then you have a good blocker as well. So Steelclaw Lance requires that you are in a Knight deck to reach its full potential. It's just perfectly playable in a creature deck outside of a dedicated Knight deck. It just loses a little bit of its value because you have to put a little bit more mana into equipping it. But +2/+2 has a significant effect on creature combat, on offense or defense. And while this has a pretty hefty color requirement, and you'll know whether or not your deck wants this, I think it's going to fill its role just fine. Shine Chaser up next. This is 1 white blue for a 1/1 uncommon fairy. It has flying and vigilance, and it gets +1/+1 if you control an artifact, and +1/+1 if you control an enchantment. You really only need one of those two things to be on board for this card to be up to snuff with just a normal card that you would want in your deck. But if you get both on board, this is actually extremely powerful. 3 mana, 3/3 Vigilant Flyer on turn 3. I wouldn't expect this to be that on turn 3 every time, but it's not super hard to get an artifact on board in this set with all of the food generation. Blue-white's not at its best there, but I mean, there is an enchantment that makes a food, so that alone will get Shine Chaser going. And on top of that, blue and white have a lot of enchantments that kind of stick around on the board. I'm thinking like the Frogify, Trapped in a Tower, there's the Sleep Lullaby. These are all just enchantments that help you deal with your opponent's creatures while also just giving you an enchantment that's going to stay on the board. And Shine Chaser will reap the benefits of that. It is very powerful if you get both of its abilities going, and if you can only get one going, it's pretty decent. If you can't get either of them going, you just don't even play this card, and you're not excited about it at all. Inspiring Veteran is up next. Red-white for a 2/2 uncommon human knight. Your other knights get +1/+1. So we saw this with the merfolk. We saw this with the vampires in Ixalan. Just a very powerful card. Playable on its own if you're red-white. If you have any number of other knights, then you get a little bit more excited about it. There's really not a lot to say about this card. If you're red-white knights, this is going to be one of the most powerful cards in your deck. And if you're not red-white knights, you don't care about this card. So there's that. Elite Headhunter is our hybrid color card for Rakdos. It's 4 black or red pips, however you want to spend your mana to cast that. It is a 2/3 uncommon human knight. It has Menace, so 4 mana, 2/3 Menace is playable. That is passable, but it's not great. It has a weird activated ability. For 3 mana, any combination of black or red, you can sacrifice another creature or an artifact, and it will deal 2 damage to target creature or planeswalker. Now, that's a relevant ability that's really strong. I don't know why this is here, though. Most of these cards, most of these gold cards are pretty good at indicating what the color pair is trying to do. Black-red is not really a sacrifice-themed deck. There are a couple ways to sacrifice things in this set, but there's not a lot of ways to, like, gain control of an opponent's creature and sacrifice it or things like that. So I don't think you want to go all in on sacrificing creatures and taking little weenie creatures if you have an Elite Headhunter, because it's a fine card on its own, and that activated ability is a real thing. I do think this card's powerful, and I think people are going to underrate it. Being able to just mop up the board with that last ability is quite nice. It doesn't hit players, so you can't finish the game off, but it does hit creatures, and that's extremely relevant, especially against blue-white. If they're locking down your creatures with enchantments, well, just sacrifice them and start killing their other creatures. Seems pretty strong to me. Not the best in the cycle, not the cleanest design in the cycle as far as the color pair archetypes are concerned, but still a solid card, and you're playing as many copies as you pick up if you're Rakdos. Deathless Knight is up next. This is the Golgari hybrid card, so 4 combination of black or green mana. It's a 4/2 uncommon skeleton knight with haste, another green creature with haste. Whenever you gain life for the first time each turn, return Deathless Knight from your graveyard to your hand. So again, not the cleanest design when it comes to trying to get you to understand what black-green decks are doing. Black-green is a food archetype. That is kind of the pushed theme of black and green. So obviously if you sacrifice food and gain life, you can get the Deathless Knight back from your graveyard to your hand. That works with anything that gains life, though. It doesn't have to be food, so a little bit awkward. But this is a nice recursive threat, a decent body. Haste does give it a little bit more oomph. If it didn't have haste, this card would not be very good. But there's not a lot of graveyard hate going around, so being able to trade this off for any relevant creature and then get it back and do it again, Pretty nice. I don't normally like 4/2s for 4 mana because they do trade down, but when you can recur that creature and do it over and over again, that's a different story. I like Deathless Knight. I don't think you first pick this card and then start slamming green-black cards. It's not really the headliner of its archetype, but if you're already in the archetype, you're happy to pick this up. Stormfist Crusader is black-red for a 2/2 rare human knight. It has menace, so 2 mana 2/2 menace is pretty strong off the bat, especially in knights. This can pick up an equipment and be a real menace. At the beginning of your upkeep, each player draws a card and loses 1 life. So that's a little bit of an awkward ability. It affects your opponent as well as you. You are presumably playing a super aggressive deck if this is in your deck, and hopefully you can just dump a bunch of extra cards out if you keep drawing extra cards, while your opponent might be playing a slower deck and might not be able to take advantage of all the extra cards you're giving them. If you're not doing that, you can actually you can actually fall behind on an ability like this by giving your opponent too many answers to your threat. So make sure that you're using this as aggressively as possible. There are some times if your opponent is just absolutely stable against you, they have a high life total, and you're playing an aggressive deck, you might not even want to put this card on the board because it will give your opponent more of an advantage than you. But the incremental life loss over time can matter. The aggressive nature of this card matters a lot since it starts attacking on turn 3 pretty early and dealing quite a bit of damage. And I think that all adds up to a pretty strong card, but one that can be a little bit risky against certain decks. Doom Foretold. This is an extremely hard card to evaluate, but we'll try our best. It's 2 white-black for a rare enchantment. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player sacrifices a non-land, non-token permanent. So they can't just dump tokens into this, which is kind of cool. If they can't, if they're all out of non-land, non-token permanents, then they discard a card, they lose 2 life, you draw a card, you gain 2 life, and you create a 2/2 white knight creature token with vigilance, and then you sacrifice Doom Foretold. So what this does is you play it, and then it goes to your opponent's turn, and they have to sacrifice something. And then it comes back to you, you have to sacrifice something, goes back to the opponent, so on and so forth, until there's somebody who, there's somebody who is unable to sacrifice a card. Now, this affects you. If you are the player who is unable to sacrifice a permanent, then you're the one who's going to lose life and discard a card, but you'll also still draw the card and gain 2 life, right? If your opponent is the first person who can't sacrifice a permanent to Doom Foretold, then they're going to get all the negative benefits, you're going to get all the positive benefits, which will leave you with a 2/2 Vigilant Knight on board and be up a card and up a little bit of life. This card is really, really weird, though, because you need to kind of make sure that you're not the one who is unable to sacrifice a card, otherwise you're losing a lot of the benefit of it, right? So you need to kind of be at parity with the opponent, or you need to put this on a board that's empty already and then just let it pass to the opponent where it'll trigger right away. I don't know, it's extremely hard to set this card up, but if you're playing a control game and you need to whittle down the board a little bit, Doom Foretold will do it. It'll just do it over time, right? If your opponent just has a bunch of permanents on board, a bunch of, artifacts, equipment, stuff like that, they have a little bit more control over when this is going to pop. And they will always just choose to lose their worst permanent. So I'm not sure how to evaluate this card. I do think it's playable. I think it has an extremely powerful effect when it does pop. You lose a lot of that benefit unless you play around your own card in a smart way. So keep that in mind. Sometimes you'll have a single permanent that you plan on sacrificing to this, and then your opponent will kill it before your turn, and then suddenly you don't have anything left. So Doom Foretold will sacrifice itself. But there you go. Doom Foretold is a little bit interesting, and not sure how I feel about it, but I think it's going to be playable. All right, moving into the high power early pick category. These are cards that are definitely pushing the boundaries of what the archetypes want to do. These are the stronger half of the gold cards, and a little bit more willing to take these early on in a pack, even though picking gold cards early is not usually the best thing in the world. First one is Wintermore Commander. This is a knight payoff. It's white-black for an uncommon human knight. It is a 2x. The toughness is equal to the number of knights you control. So on its own, it is a 2-1. It has Death Touch, and when it attacks, another target knight you control gains Indestructible until end of turn. Can't give itself Indestructible, and only on attacks, but still pretty good, right? On its base, 2 mana, 2/1 Death Toucher is already a solid card, plays offense and defense equally, pretty solid. And then with a bunch of extra knights on board, this could be a 2/3 or 2/4 Death Toucher, which is a very good attacker and a very good deterrent from being attacked. The attack trigger is also kind of cool, right? You can send this in combat with another knight. They're not going to be able to kill the other knight because of Indestructible, and if they want to kill this, they're going to have to trade something off. And assuming that you're actually attacking with another knight, this is going to be at least a 2/2 Death Toucher, which is just a solid attacker. They have to lose something to it, right? I like this card. I'm not sure knights necessarily want a defensive play like this, but this plays offense just as well, which leads me to believe that it's going to be solid in basically any knight deck. Thunderstorm Snapper is our Simic hybrid card. It's 4 blue or green mana, however you want to pay. It is a 4/4 uncommon Turtle Hydra, so 4 mana 4/4, pretty solid in this format full of 3/3s. Whenever you cast a spell with converted mana cost 5 or greater, draw a card. Not a creature spell, just a spell, right? So anything mana cost 5 or greater draws you a card. Pretty nice, too, that this curves into that. If you can play this on turn 4 and then immediately play a 5-drop on turn 5, you're going to be quite far ahead. First off, you have a 4/4, and you have whatever you just cast the turn after. And then on top of that, the Snapper will give you long-term advantage if you cast any more expensive spells. Not, again, the clear indicator of what Simic wants to do. Simic is like a weird ramp deck. I don't think it has the most well-defined theme in this set. It just happens to be a bunch of blue and green cards that might ramp. But yeah, Thunder Snapper can take advantage of ramp quite a bit, and yeah, it's just going to have a real presence on the board regardless of whether you're drawing cards or not. 4 mana 4/4 seems like it's going to be solid in this format. Savvy Hunter might be the best gold card in the set if you can really support it. It's 1 black green for a 3/3 uncommon human warrior, so 3 mana 3/3 again. We're seeing quite a few of those. Whenever it attacks or blocks, create a food token. That by itself would be really strong, right? Especially since green-black is the archetype that cares about food. That does a lot of things. It either fuels your food strategies, your other cards that care about food. This is one of the few recursive ways to make food, and it does it on blocks as well, right? If you trade this off in combat, then you're going to be left with a food, which is pretty nice. If you have the green-black archetype going and you have some of the food payoffs, then Savvy Hunter is going to pay you off for, picking it. On top of that, you can sacrifice 2 food to draw a card, which is a really nice way to use that extra food, right? Again, a lot of your food payoff, they're going to be vying for your resources, right? You just won't have enough food to activate all of the different things that care about it, right? Cards like Bognaughty and the Wicked Wolf and Savvy Hunter, they all want you to use food for different things, so you need to find a way to generate extra food, and Savvy Hunter will do that for you through means of combat. Solid card without the food payoffs. Even against aggressive decks, if this is doing nothing other than just gaining you incremental life when it attacks or blocks because you're sacrificing the food for life, then that's pretty good. But being able to also sacrifice those food for extra cards seems really strong to me. So I am first picking Savvy Hunter when I see it, and then I'm looking for extra ways to make food on top of just its ability. Resolute Rider is our Orzhov gold card or hybrid card, so 4 mana, black and white, however you want to spend that mana. It is a 4/2 uncommon human knight, so another 4 mana 4/2, but this has some protection built in as well. So for 2 hybrid Orzhov mana, 2 white or black mana, you can give it lifelink until end of turn, and for 3 hybrid Orzhov mana, you can give it indestructible until end of turn. So this card battles quite nicely. When it trades off, you're probably going to be up on life by a significant margin, since this is an 8-point life swing, right? You're attacking for 4, you're potentially gaining 4, and the fact that you can protect it with indestructible is super sweet as well. The turn you play this, it's not going to be super relevant since you're probably not going to have mana up to protect it, but if you untap and you have a Resolute Rider on board, and you get to play a 5th mana source, this is a real threat, right? It gets to attack and hold up indestructible if your opponent blocks, and if you find that lifelink is something worth dumping your mana into, you have that option as well. So this just happens to be a solid knight. Again, black-white is a knight deck, and it'll take anything that has the word knight written on it, even if there's no real synergy there. This card does not synergize with other knights. It's just a very solid standalone knight, and you're happy to play it in your black-white deck. Rampart Smasher is your Gruul hybrid card, 4 total Gruul mana, green or red. It is a 5/5 uncommon giant, and it's pretty simple. It can't be blocked by knights or walls. I think there's, 2 walls in the set? Maybe 3. I think there's 3 walls in this set, so that part is just kind of there for flavor reasons, but it might end up mattering, so don't forget about it. Not being able to be blocked by knights is way more relevant, since there's a ton of those floating around, 3 different colors. Actually, I think all colors have knights, it's just centered in the Mardu colors. Similar to the Thunder Snapper, Rampart Smasher isn't like some clear indication that Gruul is like some knight-hating, wall-hating deck or anything like that. It just cares about big stompy creatures, and Rampart Smasher is a big stompy creature. Very green card, just a bunch of stats, no evasion, no trample, nothing like that. But yeah, it can pick up trample and be a real menacing threat, and sometimes it's unblockable, which is a pretty big deal for a 5/5. Oakham Ranger is your Selesnya hybrid card, so 4 green or white mana for a 2/2 uncommon elf knight. So 4 mana 2/2, it can tap to give your creatures +1/+1 until end of turn. I think people are underrating this card a lot. Even without the adventure half, which we'll get to in a second, 4 mana 2/2 that can tap to just pump your entire board is pretty nice. First off, that means that it's a 3/3 on defense once it gets to start tapping. Your other creatures play defense a lot better since they're all +1/+1 bigger on a whim whenever you just want to tap this card. And then your creatures attack a little bit better too, right? The Ranger itself probably isn't getting in combat too often. It's not going to be your attacker, right? This is a defensive card for sure, but you can attack with all your other creatures, and then that really messes up combat if you can just give them all +1/+1 at the mercy of just tapping this creature. Now, on top of this, there is an adventure as well. It's also 4 Selesnya mana, so the same cost to cast the Ranger is what you're paying to cast the Adventure, and it's a little on the weaker side. It just makes 2 1/1 human creature tokens. It's a sorcery, if I didn't mention that. So 4 mana to make 2 1/1 tokens at sorcery speed is obviously not good, but it's a bonus. It's something that you can activate if you just happen to want to do that, right? A lot of times you just want to cast the friggin' Ranger. You want to get that thing on board and start activating it, but sometimes you have 8 mana and you go bring back and then you cast the Ranger, or sometimes you just have a nice curve out. You don't need the Ranger on board, so you just want to maximize the value of the card, so you cast the sorcery on turn 4 and then you cast the Ranger on turn 5, and maybe you get some adventure payoffs, right? If you can get this guy to come down with a counter, or you can get some extra bonus by getting the Ranger out there from adventure in it, then yeah, why not do that, right? So I think people look at this, they see that the sorcery is a little bit on the weaker side, they see that the body's not great, and they think this card sucks, but I actually think it's going to swing games quite a bit, and it's going to be very annoying to have to face one of these down. Marilee Pixie is up next. This is a weird Simic card. It's green-blue for a 2/2 uncommon fairy. It has flying, and it taps for green or blue. So, I don't know. This card is strange. Again, Simic is like kind of a rampy deck. If you look at the gold cards that are in Simic, it makes you believe that it's a rampy deck, but it doesn't have to be, right? Marilee Pixie is just a good beater. It's a 2 mana 2/2 flyer, which gets in there. There's a couple of 2-power flyers in this set for 2 mana that we've seen. The Order of Midnight, the Hypnotic Fairy or Spectre or whatever the heck it's called. Those cards are good, and this card is good too if you can cast it, and you can choose to, ramp ahead with it instead. If you draw this later in the game, it's going to be fine. It's a 2 mana 2/2 flyer. If you draw early in the game, you can use it to kind of accelerate your game plan. I just don't think it's what Simic wants to be or needs to be doing, right? And it's also weird that it's a fairy, a green fairy, when there's no real fairy tribal stuff in this set. So strange card, but a good one. Lock Dragon is next. This is the Izzet hybrid card, so 4 blue or red mana in any combination. It's a 3/2. It's an uncommon dragon. It has flying, so 4 mana, 3/2 flyer that's easy to cast in a Is It deck? Yeah, that's a solid card. Just a Snap and Drake. But there's an extra bonus. Whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. I like the way that fits into the Is It strategy here. Remember, Is It wants you to draw at least a second card on any given turn to trigger those other abilities, and this does it at a pretty low cost. You're getting a Snap and Drake that will help you trigger your other abilities. It does it when it enters the battlefield, so you get it right away, and then it can do it again on attacks, and even if you're not triggering those other abilities, this does let you shape up your hand a little bit. If you're drawing duds or you're drawing just too many extra lands, you can turn those lands into extra cards. Kind of like Keldon Raider, but a repeatable flying Keldon Raider, and I think that makes for a pretty strong flyer. Grumbly, the Generous, is very unsettling to look at, but it's 1 red-green for a 3/3 uncommon legendary Goblin Shaman. So 3 mana 3/3, again, another one of those. Each other non-human creature you control enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. So green-red has a couple humans, right? There are human knights, there's a couple green humans, but for the most part, you're just going to have a bunch of monsters and goblins and ogres and stuff like that in your deck, and Grumbly will put extra counters on them at basically no cost, right? You're not paying anything to get a 3 mana 3/3 into your deck, and having all of your additional plays after that just come in a little bit stronger is quite good. So Grumbly might be one of the easy first pick cards. Seems fairly splashable in a deck that doesn't have a lot of humans, and even though I still think this green-red non-human shtick is kind of weird for the set, and it's all flavorful and kind of weird mechanically, yeah, Grumbly is a quite powerful card, and one that you should be picking up early. Fireborn Knight is our Boros Night. It is 4 Boros hybrid mana, so any combination of red or white. It's a 2/3 uncommon human knight with double strike, so that's essentially a 4/3 for 4. It's a knight as well, and 2 of that power has first strike, which is pretty decent. That's a nice starting rate, right? If you're Boros, this isn't hard to cast, and it's a knight, so it probably matters for your deck as well. You can also pay 4 Boros mana to get it +1/+1 until end of turn, and that's essentially like +2/+1 given the double strike, right? This card is very good if you augment it. We saw another double striker at common. It was a 1/2 for 3. I wasn't very impressed with that, but this one I like a lot more because its starting rate is a little bit higher. It has a little bit more toughness and has a relevant activated ability. You might get to the point where you can pay 8 mana to just go ham with this card, but I think this is the type of knight you're looking to stick equipment on or use your combat tricks on and just get your opponent dead. Arcanist Owl is also sweet art. I love looking at this card. It looks awesome. But anyway, it's Azorius. It's 4 hybrid Azorius mana, any combination of blue or white. It is an uncommon artifact bird. It matters that it's an artifact creature, and it's a 3/3 flyer. So 4 mana 3/3 flyer is pretty good, and an artifact is mostly a benefit. It could be a downside against some of the things that care about destroying artifacts in this set, but you won't run into those too often, so being an artifact creature is mostly an upside here. When it enters battlefield, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal an artifact or enchantment from among them, put them in your hand, the rest go to the bottom, blah, blah, blah. So, assuming that you have a reasonable number of artifacts and enchantments, you went pretty hard on being an Azorius deck. Arcanist Owl is going to be a performing flyer that also cantrips into another spell. Yeah, that's really powerful. You can pick this card up very early and then start prioritizing the enchantment-based removal spells like Frogify and Trapped in a Tower, Sleep Lullaby, those cards I keep coming back to, Glass Casket, stuff like that. While also just picking up a couple more artifact creatures to make sure that your owls can cantrip into something. You'll brick some amount of the time, right? I don't think you're going to have Azorius decks with like 10 to 12 artifacts or enchantments unless you really force it, and I'm not sure you should do that. But there's plenty of artifacts in this set and ways to make sure that the owl gives you value. And even if you do brick, you're getting a 4 mana 3/3 flyer, which is going to be able to hold its own. So I like this card quite a bit. If blue-white ends up being one of the premier archetypes, I could see taking it very, very highly. But as it stands, it's a good, solid standalone card that also gives you a little bit of extra value when you draft around it. Favorrow Elder is 1 green-white for a 0/0 rare Treefolk Druid with Vigilance. 3 mana 0/0 Vigilance. Really nailed it. it gets +1/+1 for each color among permanents you control. So on its own, it's green-white. So this is going to be a 2/2 vigilance creature. If you can stick any other colored permanents on board that aren't green or white, it'll get a little bit bigger. So your hybrid color cards, let's say you play an Arcanist Owl next to a Favorrow Elder because you have quadruple white in your deck, then yeah, the Owl will count as blue as well and give the Favorrow Elder another +1/+1. Honestly, you probably don't care too much about the power and toughness of the Elder unless you're in some weird 5-color deck, because its activated ability is what you're looking for. It says tap for each color among permanents you control, add 1 mana of that color. So on its own, it will tap for green and white, and then if you have any other color permanents on board, it will tap for those permanents colors as well. So this can potentially do the Bloom Tender thing where it taps for 4 or 5 mana if you have a bunch of different mana symbols on your board. But on its own, it's already a 3 mana 2/2 Vigilance that taps for 2 mana and really just accelerates you into your late game plays. If you play this on turn 3, you can actually drop a 6-drop on turn 4 with the right kind of hand. So crazy amount of ramp here. It does, you need something to use your mana on for this to really be that powerful, but I think it's fine on its own, right? You're not passing this card basically ever if you're in green-white, and even if you're not an extremely, late game ramp deck, you're going to be happy to have it. The Royal Saiyans, this is our first Planeswalker, and yeah, it's not a super bomb, but it's a pretty solid card. So Will and Rowan, they're 1 blue-red for a legendary. Will Rowan, Planeswalker, start at 5 loyalty, which is pretty high for a 3 mana Planeswalker. So 3 mana, 5 loyalty, +1, draw a card, discard a card. So you can go up to 6 loyalty on the Royal Scions right away while also getting your second card for the turn, which matters in blue-red. Filtering extra lands away, right? This is draw first, then discard, so there's virtually no disadvantage to doing that. If it was discard then draw, that would be a little bit on the weaker side, but it's not. So very solid ability there, right? The other +1, which also puts them up to 6, is target creature gets +2/+0 and gains first strike and trample until end of turn. It's a little bit weird, right? Where's the trample coming from? What is blue about this ability? I don't know. I'm assuming the first ability is blue, the second one's red, but where's trample coming from? I have no idea. Anyway, flavor things aside, that's a solid ability if you plan to be attacking. Blue-red has some pretty good flyers. It has decent, creatures, and being able to augment them in any way is relevant. First strike and trample is not going to matter too much on flyers, but hey, it's something, right? I think really the Royal Scions, you're going to want to use their first +1 more often, but if the damage matters, you'll use the second +1. The -8 here, which isn't that hard to get to, right? It's +1 to 6, +1 to 7, +1 to 8, and then -8. In this case, the -8 is draw 4 cards. When you do, the Royal Scions deal damage to any target equal to the number of cards in your hand. So being able to draw 4 and then shoot something for at least 4, probably more than 4, is kind of crazy. And if somehow you manage to go +1, +1, +1, -8, you're going to just win whatever game you're playing. So that's kind of nice. The reason this is not a super bomb card, despite being a high loyalty 3 mana Planeswalker, is it does require 2 colors, right? And it's a little bit loose with the theme, right? It has a nice +1 ability, but the rest of it doesn't matter too much unless you get to the -8. But they don't protect themselves at all. They have no way of making a creature better at blocking. They don't remove creatures from the board with either of their +1 abilities. They don't even shrink things, and the +2/+0 first strike trample only lasts until the end of your turn, not until your next turn. So they are extremely vulnerable to whatever's going on board. If your opponent plays a 2-drop and then this is the first play of your game, it's just going to die and you're not going to get to that -8. But if you're stable, this does what basically any kind of value Planeswalker does, and it threatens a pretty powerful ultimate without just winning the game on its own. So yeah, I think you should be taking the Royal Scions pretty highly, but just note that it's not as powerful as some of the other cards we're about to talk about. And, speaking of those cards we're about to talk about, a couple bombs here, a couple gold bombs, which we expect out of the multicolor category. The first one, Lockemere Serpent. This is 4 blue-black for a rare 7/7 Serpent with Flash. So even if this was just like some uncommon vanilla 6 mana 7/7 flash, I'm just playing that. That's going to be a combat trick that also puts the biggest creature on board. Usually you can eat something with it too, which is kind of crazy. So for blue mana, you can sacrifice an island and it can't be blocked that turn. So you can just kill your opponent in the course of a couple turns after having already eaten their creature by flashing this in, which is pretty ridiculous. For black mana, you can sacrifice a swamp to gain a life and draw a card. Not as relevant since your opponent's just going to be dead to the blue ability, but very relevant if you happen to be in a stalled game where you can't actually take the time to attack. Maybe you need the Serpent on defense to not lose or something like that. And then the black ability comes up. And then for blue-black, you can exile 5 cards from an opponent's graveyard, return the Serpent from your graveyard to your hand, but only at sorcery speed, so you don't get to like surprise flash it in or anything like that. Your opponent knows about it. That's actually kind of insane, right? If this ever gets milled or something like that from your library, then presumably you'll have enough resources in the late game to just put it back in your hand, and the only cost for doing that is 2 mana and exiling cards from your opponent's graveyard. You don't actually have to pay an exorbitant amount of mana for that. You don't have to, sacrifice any lands to do it. You just sacrifice a tiny little bit of tempo, and you do it at sorcery speed, and boom. You have a 7/7 flash in your hand. Your opponent knows about it now, but what are they going to do, right? Really, the blue ability is what makes this card for me. It just attacks so well and kills your opponent so quickly that if they don't have an answer within just a couple turns, it's going to kill them. And if you are playing defense, the black ability comes up and can draw you extra answers as well, while also just giving this thing flash is ridiculous. There's going to be a lot of games where you think you're winning, you're attacking, and then they flash this in, eat a creature, and suddenly you're losing to the Lockemere Serpent. So yeah, first pick this card. You don't even really have to do a lot of work with the blue-black mill theme, since by the time you get to the late game and you're flashing this in and eating creatures, your opponent's probably going to have 5 cards in their graveyard. And that's assuming they even have a way to kill the Serpent. The Serpent might just kill them before they find an answer to it. Outlaws Merriment is one of the, I believe, 3 mythic rares we're going to talk about here. It's an annoying card, but it's a good one. It's 1 red, white for a mythic enchantment. Beginning of your upkeep, choose 1 at random. Create a red and white creature token with those characteristics. So you're going to randomly either make a red-white 3/1 human with trample and haste, a 2/1 human cleric with lifelink and haste, or a 1/2 human rogue with haste, and when this creature enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to any target. So any of those are good, right? Assuming that you are in a stable position, you can stick Outlaws Merriment, and then you get to pass the turn and it comes back to you, you're going to start generating just random value turn after turn after turn. I don't even really know which of these tokens are the ones you're really vying for, but you get them randomly, so it doesn't matter so much, right? The 3/1 haste tramplers, they come in, they beat down. The 2/1s, they might come in and beat down, but they can also play defense quite nice with the lifelink. And then the 1/2s can come down and ping things and make combat a little bit more difficult or just deal damage to your opponent. And you get one of these every single upkeep, right? It doesn't do anything the turn it comes into play, so there's a little bit of risk there, but I think the long-term advantage of this card is just worth it. And even though the color requirements are very restrictive and it doesn't really play into the night theme in red-white, this card should win a decent number of the games you play it in. Alright, 2 more to talk about. You probably know which ones we're getting to. First up is Oko, Thief of Crowns. This is a new planeswalker. It is 1 green-blue for a 4 loyalty mythic Oko. It has +2 creative food tokens. So this is, I think, the third, maybe the last, the third card that we've seen in this set that can make multiple food tokens over the course of a game. It's a little bit weird that this is in blue-green because, again, blue-green seems to want to be some weird amalgamation deck. We saw the Marilee Pixie, we saw the Thunderstorm Snapper. Oko making food tokens doesn't really play into that. Blue doesn't seem to care about food tokens at all in this set for the most part. It does care about artifacts. So there's that, and green cares about food. So this is more of like a bridge between those 2 archetypes than it is a really strong, full-on archetype defining card itself. But as a standalone card, that food matters because Oko has +1. Target artifact or creature loses all abilities and becomes a green elk creature with base power and toughness 3/3. So you can either turn that food you made into a 3/3. You can turn an artifact you already controlled when you play Oko into a 3/3. You can nerf an opponent's creature, maybe their biggest thing, by turning that into a 3/3. You can do a lot of different things, right? Just being able to +2, make a food token, and then +1, turn that food into an elk and make a 3/3 is pretty strong. And being able to alternate that turn after turn is quite nice, right? Every other turn you get a 3/3 while Oko continues to tick up. Seems pretty strong to me. And it's a 3 loyalty planeswalker, so you get to start doing this and put it up to 6 loyalty. Starting on like turn 4, you'll have 3/3s to protect it, and then it just keeps ticking up and up and up, and your opponent has to find a way to kill it through an army of 3/3s. And that's all while ignoring the -5, which says exchange control of target artifact or creature you control and target creature an opponent controls with power 3 or less. So you can give them a food, and you can steal a little dorky creature from them. Or you can give them a small creature of yours and steal a slightly better creature. You can't just take their best creature, right? They have to have power 3 or less, but that's quite nice, right? The fact that you can turn some of their creatures into 3/3 elks with the +1 ability and then maybe give them a food in exchange for that elk just means that Oko has a lot of flexibility. You should be able to control a board pretty safely while you have an Oko on board. And if you play this on turn 3, your opponent is going to have a very hard time dealing with what you're going to do over the course of the next couple turns. The combination of abilities all kind of work together while also being able to disrupt the opponent. And at its very, very worst, you can use the +2 to just gain some life over the course of the game, right? Since you can still sacrifice those foods for life, which again is not something you really want to do. If I were to start off with Oko, I would look to be green, black, and splash in blue for Oko, since the food really matters for that archetype. But I think you'll be happy playing it in any deck where the mana works out. And our last final card here is Garruk, Cursed Huntsman with the real art. It's 4 black, green, 6 mana for a 5 loyalty walker. It's a legendary mythic Garruk, obviously. Pretty insane 0 ability. 0, create 2/2/2 black and green wolf creature tokens. When those creatures die, put a loyalty counter on each Garruk you control. So being able to 0 and make 2/2/2s is actually quite insane. There aren't a lot of planeswalkers in the history of Magic that make 2 tokens every single turn. Garruk does it while not taken down, but also not taken up. Now, the -3 says destroy target creature, draw a card. It's pretty boring, but obviously very good, right? That's just a straight up 2-for-1 every time you can use that ability. Kill your opponent's best creature, draw a card, boom, Garruk replaces itself and your opponent's down a Gar. If you can 0, stabilize the board, and then -3, and then keep 0, and after that, Garruk's going to have no trouble losing the game. Like, you're no trouble winning the game, I should say. You're just going to win any game where Garruk sticks around for more than a couple turns. And then the -6 is actually interesting because there is no plus ability on Garruk. The -6 says you get an emblem with creatures you control get +3/+3 and have trample. So obviously, since Garruk does not have a plus ability, you have to use the 0 ability and then get those wolves to die in order for Garruk to go up to be able to -6. But I don't think you need to -6 for Garruk to be insane, right? You can just 0, 0, 0, 0, and you're going to win that game. You can -3 the turn it comes down, and then 0, 0, 0, and you're going to win the game. It's just extremely difficult for your opponent to be able to deal with Garruk. Assuming that you put it on any sort of even remotely stable board, you're going to win that game. So Garruk seems incredible to me. Very early first pick card. Probably, I don't know, is this just the best card in the set? It might be. Garruk seems unbeatable in any sort of regular game of Magic. And yeah, it's very splashable as well, especially being in green. Same with Oko. Just being green planeswalkers already means you're more splashable. But Garruk being a game-dominating 6-drop means that it's even more splashable than that. So that's going to go ahead and do it for our multicolor cards. A lot of powerful stuff here, a lot of situational cards, but also just solid payoffs for being in certain colors. The hybrid cycle is not exactly pushed, but those cards are just going to be playable and good in whatever decks you can muster together as long as you're able to cast those cards. So take your pick, right? Take what you will of it. If you're in any of these color combinations, basically any card we mentioned here besides the first couple in the sideline category are going to make your deck, and they're going to be decent there. So that leaves us with one final video: the colorless cards, the artifacts, the lands, and that will wrap it up for Throne of Eldraine. Thanks for still being here. If you're still listening, feel free to subscribe below. Wouldn't mind that. Find us on Twitter, MTG_Manarux, and let's go ahead and wrap it up. I'll see y'all in the final video.